You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we have some major news here from ProPublica regarding Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice, accepting luxury travel on yachts and jets and accepting a number of other gifts. A number of watchdog groups have come out and said that there is no known precedent for anything like this in U.S. history. So, I guess the question here that everyone is wondering is, what is the punishment for something like this, if there is even a punishment for something like this?
Yeah, I think "if" is the operative word, Brian. For a very long time, it seems like the Supreme Court has been an ethics-free zone and certainly an accountability-free zone once ethics are found to have been breached by a Supreme Court justice. Now, in Title V of the United States Code, there's a series of laws that has to deal with these financial reporting statements that federal government employees, including judges and justices, are required to fill out every year. In theory, there is a punishment. If you omit to put something on these financial disclosure forms, a civil suit could be brought and you could be penalized up to $50,000. If you falsify a financial disclosure report, in theory, there is a criminal penalty of up to 1 year in jail. Now, are these statutes ever sort of dusted off, brought out of mothballs and applied to government employees who omit or misrepresent something on their financial disclosure forms? In my experience as a 30-year Fed, I'm going to say almost never. And as applied to Supreme Court justices, I'm going to take the almost out of it and just say never.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question. You were subject to these same disclosure rules as a federal employee for a long time. Can you give us some insight into how seriously you would take something like this? Because you just mentioned how some of these more serious penalties weren't applied. So how seriously did you take it, and why? Because what would ultimately happen?
I took it deadly seriously. And let me tell you, it was the bane of my existence every year. These are really burdensome forms to fill out. They're also really important forms to fill out. But I would want to make sure that, I put every decimal point exactly where it should be. I double and triple check to make sure I didn't omit something that these forms required me to report. And I think that's the way most government officials and employees, take their responsibilities, their oath of office, and the ethics of their position. We take it deadly seriously. But when it comes to the Supreme Court, it just seems like it's this no holds barred, ethics-free workplace. I know that sounds like it's a joke, but we have seen the Clarence Thomases of the world sort of engage in sitting on and deciding cases in which he has a direct conflict. And conflict is actually the most operative word here. That's why we are required to fill out these forms. It's to avoid conflicts.
So what would be the punishment for you if you were found to have lied or falsified on one of these disclosure forms?
Well, if it was an omission, an intentional omission, not a mistaken omission,
Yeah.
the reality is, even though a suit could be brought against me and I could be fined up to $50,000, I would probably be reprimanded. I would probably be put through some remedial federal government forms training. Oh, the joy. I could even be demoted. At most, I think I could be fired from the federal government. And of course, I could be fined $50,000. I don't think that happens often. That would be for somebody who really intentionally omits some very serious information. If it was an intentional falsification, well, not only could I be prosecuted under Title V, but I could also, in theory, be prosecuted for what we call a 1001 violation, which is intentionally lying to a federal government agency or to a federal government agent. It doesn't have to be under oath, and that could subject somebody to up to 5 years in prison.
Glenn, why is it important that someone like Clarence Thomas disclose when he's invited onto a super yacht with a Republican megadonor, for example?
Conflict, conflict, conflict. We are now learning this parade of horribles that was these, lavish perks that this sort of hardcore right-wing billionaire was bestowing on Clarence Thomas year after year perhaps decade after decade. ProPublica is reporting that, one trip alone was valued at $500,000. And when you have that kind of access and arguably influence over a Supreme Court justice, do you think the justice is going to be a little bit more receptive when you are pushing a radical Second Amendment agenda, or when you're trying to outlaw abortion, revoke women's constitutional privacy rights, as the Supreme Court did? It's all about avoiding conflict, avoiding actual conflict, and avoiding even the appearance of conflict. And, none of that seems to have mattered to Clarence Thomas. And, then the next question is, okay, what might be done about it?
Well, Dick Durbin, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, had come out and promised to act here. He issued a strongly worded letter. What do you think the likelihood, though, of something like this passing would be?
We often see strongly worded letters from politicians, and I have the
out there.
utmost. What's that?
Their specialty out there.
Yeah, and I have the utmost respect for Senator Durbin as the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he said that these ethical lapses by Justice Thomas are a call to action, and he promised that the Senate Judiciary Committee will act. That's great. Let's hold him to that. But what does will act mean? What can it mean? Because there are real separation of powers issues when it comes to the Senate or the House Congress trying to impose some sort of, code of conduct, some sort of rules that must be followed by the Supreme Court. There really are dicey separation of powers issues. But I contend that one thing that should be done is to shed a little bit of daylight on it. Let's open congressional hearings into Clarence Thomas's violation of his responsibility to accurately fill out these public disclosure forms. They say sunlight is the best disinfectant. Well, let's shed a little sunlight, even if it doesn't result in any concrete fixes or legislation at the end of the day. Let's expose it to public view.
Right. I agree. If he didn't do anything wrong, then transparency should have no adverse impacts as far as he's concerned. Then let's finish off with this. How important do you believe that implementing some type of ethics rules for Supreme Court justices is?
I feel like our Supreme Court has, if not been circling the drain for a while now, its legitimacy has taken an enormous hit. And, I always think back to what I think Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said first. I hope I'm not misattributing this. She said, I'm surprised that anybody follows our precedent, because we don't have a law enforcement agency to enforce our rulings. We don't have an army or a military. And, it's all about the Supreme Court retaining its legitimacy. And boy, has its legitimacy been eroding in recent years. So I think, even just in the name of self-preservation, you would think Chief Justice Roberts would be open to imposing some sort of ethical rules and obligations governing, for example, when a justice must recuse from a case if he or she has an actual interest in the outcome of the case. To me, it feels like win-win, because then, the Supreme Court is not going to have this criticism coming at it all the time for violating, what we all think are kind of common sense rules of ethics. And frankly, Brian, they're rules of ethics that judges, all federal judges, are required to follow. Why should the 9 Supreme Court justices be exempt from following those same rules? But again, I think it's win-win, because I think anything that enhances the legitimacy of the court in the eyes of the citizenry is good for everybody.
Yeah, and I would assume that these judges would want to set a good precedent for the rest of the judiciary. Like, if there are any rules that are worth following, like, these people, of all people, should be following them. They should hold themselves to a higher standard, and yet here we are.
Yeah, and Brian, let me ask you, you're the political expert. What do you think the realistic possibility is that there is some kind of a political fix for this problem?
I don't think that the Republican Party has any incentive to do that. I think the part where the Supreme Court, you mentioned the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. I think that the part where they need to maintain their legitimacy is gone. I think that the whole point of the Republican Party is right now, knowing that they're losing influence, that they're losing generations of Americans, that really they just require some minority of American, that they only have the support of some minority of Americans. At this point, it's just about doing whatever they can to basically cement in their power however they can do it. And so it's not about retaining the legitimacy of these institutions. I think that train has left the station. Like, the veil has lifted now. It's just about using what power they do have to consolidate their grip on power elsewhere. And so that's why we're seeing drop boxes being taken away. We're seeing gerrymandering. We're seeing voting restrictions being passed across the country. We're seeing voting locations on college campuses closed, because now we're in the part where they know that they can't get any semblance of a majority of Americans to vote them into power. And so they have to take what minority, faction of power they do have right now and just use it to consolidate the rest of power moving forward. And so I think that, when you have someone like Clarence Thomas, there's no incentive for the Republican-led House to pass any type of reform. I think there's no incentive for these Republican senators to vote for anything like this, because it's not about democracy for them. It's about consolidating power, full stop. We're seeing that in the states almost on a daily basis. And, we've seen it all the way up to the top of the federal government with someone like Clarence Thomas himself, whose own wife was involved in the events of January 6th, whose sole purpose was to try and overturn a federal election. So the rot pervades the entirety of that party. So, in terms of the likelihood that I think that we'll see Republicans do the right thing here and vote for some type of ethics reform among Supreme Court justices, I wouldn't hold my breath. But I think, I hope that the rest of the country looks at this and looks at, like I said, the rot that pervades that party and just the brazen corruption that we're seeing almost on a daily basis at this point. And even those pro-democracy Republican voters out there, even those independent voters who are on the fence, who are, Obama, Trump voters, whatever it was, I hope that they can recognize the ways that this is actually hurting democracy writ large. And hopefully, in the next election and elections moving forward, we'll kind of have a realignment of people who put country over party. So, but that remains to be seen. But with that said, if we have any updates, we'll make sure to stay on top of it. If you want to keep up with legal news, make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.